Welcome to MMO Graveyard, a new series of mine in which we'll take a look at the large past of previous MMOs and discover how they were successful, why they died off, what new innovations they brought to the MMO genre, the pinnacle of their successes, and their last living moments. Today we're going to be talking about Warhammer Online: Age of Reckoning. So let's get right down to development. Warhammer Online: Age of Reckoning had a very rough development process. The game development began under the company Climax Studios, which had been responsible for the Warcraft 2 The Dark Saga port on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, ETV Off-Road Fury 3 and Off-Road Fury 4 for the PlayStation 2, which were very good games, and more recently Assassin's Creed Chronicles. So there was basically two versions of this game. This was the first version of the game that started development. The project was cancelled though in June 2004 when Games Workshop, the rights holder to the Warhammer license, determined that the rollout costs would be too high. Development of the game though was not officially stopped until late 2004 due to the difficulty in securing a publishing agreement. I'm pretty sure you guys can see early gameplay footage of this game at some point, or some concept art or something. But basically the game was canned and development was stopped. So the game was basically still being developed and would have been completely different all around if the game had continued development. It should be noted that there was also talks in which World of Warcraft would have instead possibly been World of Warhammer or something similar, though the license was never acquired by Blizzard at the time. So if the rumor is true, I guess Blizzard decided to stick with the Warcraft license, which was in many ways comparable to Warhammer, depending on how you look at that. When the license became available again, Games Workshop was approached by Mythic Entertainment, who acquired the license and began development of the game from scratch. Mythic then cancelled its Imperator Online project in favor of the Warhammer one, as Warhammer was seen as much more profitable, and it made more sense for the development resources to go towards it. During development of the game, there was a lot of hype created, arguably some of the most hype for an MMO game ever, maybe outside of Star Wars: The Old Republic, but that is highly debatable, and you will see why as this video goes on. I remember during this time I was part of this hype, as I was looking for a game that would get me finally away from World of Warcraft, and I basically followed the development of this game almost religiously, as sad as that is. There were a lot of video blogs, concept art, and a man by the name of Paul Barnett who helped hype the game up, describing it as, well, you can see what I'm talking about here in this video.
Warhammer, been around for a long time. It's really exciting, and it's really good if you're going to do an MMO, because it does lots of really important things. The first thing it does, it's iconic in its look. They've had 23 years to get this right. We know what elves look like, we know how powerful orcs are, we know how gritty dwarves can be, so we've got to look. That's dead important, and we've been following it in the game. The second thing we need is an excuse to smash the living crap out of each other. And we've got that. Pages, novels, thousands of pages of reasons why dwarves don't like the green skins, and the dark elves don't like the high elves, and humans don't like chaos. So that's great. But the third and most important thing, if you're going to have a subscription-based MMO, is a perpetual war. You can't have an end. That would be bad. And Warhammer helps us again. The whole thing is built so that there is no ending. There is just epic, heroic, perpetual struggle. Or any combination. A struggle that's epically heroic. And that's what we're doing.
So as you guys can see, obviously, looking at that speech, it seems like, holy shit, this game is going to be amazing. It's going to be like this fucking second coming of all MMOs. It's going to be the next World of Warcraft. And yeah, it's going to be fucking amazing. Basically, there was a lot of hype surrounding this MMO. This was back when MMOs played a huge role in the gaming industry, and a lot of people were interested in them. Not so much as comparable to like nowadays, where MMOs do not play as a gigantic role as they used to. The game had a somewhat rough development process, like I said, and a huge beta process. This is where one of the key factors that ensured the game's failure came about, in my opinion. You guys aren't going to believe this, but while they decided, due to EA pushing the release date and wanting to get the game out as soon as possible, typical EA of course, they cut out 4 capital cities from launch and 4 classes. Now, anybody who actually plays MMOs knows how huge this was. There was literally leaps of people crying on the forums about this, along with cancelled pre-orders. So many people had already, due to the massive amounts of hype created, decided beforehand which races and classes they wanted to play, And as you can imagine, 4 entire cities being cut from launch, along with 4 classes, meant that many people were going to be left having to pick something else come at launch, and for many people there wasn't really anything suitable for them to play. The developers had actually cut 4 out of the 6 capital cities in the game. That's right, 4 out of the 6 capital cities, which had already been shown beforehand in gameplay footage and in the beta. So we had already seen this content, and now it was being cut in favor of 1 capital city for each faction, and getting rid of 4 classes that they just couldn't make work, according to them, though they later implemented these classes. So I don't know. I think it was just an excuse in hindsight. Among the cut classes, though, were the Choppa, which was a greenskin, the Hammerer, which was a dwarf, the Blackguard, which was a dark elf, and the Knight of the Blazing Sun, which was the Empire. In this MMO, classes were restricted to race, though the opposing faction did have mirror classes. So for example, the Swordmaster, which was part of the Empire, and a High Elf, the class that I wanted to play back in the day, had the Blackguard as a mirror class, though later on the Blackguards were actually implemented to reflect this. So there was 2 racial cities at launch, Altdorf for the Empire and the Inevitable City for Chaos. Altdorf was more of like the human capital, and the Inevitable City was more of the Chaos capital, but they made it work for all the races. The Greenskins, Dwarves, and Elves were homeless until later on down the line when they actually implemented these cities in future patches. I think the worst thing about this, though, was the fact that this was done directly prior to the launch of the game, and many players did not see it coming. The good news, though, is that this content later was put into the game in future patches, like I said, and the game still had a successful launch with nearly 1 million active players. I think it was actually closer to 800,000 to 900,000 active players right at the start. So this concludes the development part of this video. Next, we're going to move on to take a look at this game's successes. So how successful really was this game? Well, upon the release, the game had an average review rating of 85% and nearly 1 million players. There are a lot of systems in this game that also worked very well and that other MMOs in the future would take lessons from, like World of Warcraft, The Elder Scrolls Online, and Star Wars The Old Republic, and probably a few others like Rift. This game was mostly PvP dominated and focused on a system called RVR, in which players would fight other players and to a lesser extent NPCs. Each activity generated victory points, which measured a realm's progress in capturing a zone. When one realm reached a designated amount of victory points in a particular zone, that zone fell under their control and war was pushed deeper into enemy territory. So this back and forth struggle for zone control continued until one side held 2 racial pairings, and then the attacking side would sack, loot, and pillage the enemy's capital. So in this game, you could actually sack the enemy's capital. Imagine something like Alterac Valley, but on a grander scale, where the winning faction gains enough resources and then could sack the enemy's capital, which in current WoW would just make people cry and probably quit. But anyway, least to say, this game was PvP focused. It had random public events as well, which many other games in the future would learn and take from, in which the player would encounter random public quest events, and players would then come together and complete these events together and gain rewards from doing so. You see this a lot in MMOs like Guild Wars 2 now. So there was also a system in which the player could also queue up for a scenario, or in WoW's term, a battleground, without having to actually go to an NPC in the world. So if you guys played World of Warcraft, players were used to having to go to a certain NPC and then queue up for a battleground, and they would have to stay in that vicinity, and then the queue would pop, and then they would be transported back to the vendor after the battleground. So in this game, the player would then be transported from the world that they were in, so whatever place they were in the world, to the scenario, and then back into the world after they were done. Blizzard instantly took this idea and threw it into World of Warcraft like a few months later. Many other MMOs in the future would also take this idea. So you guys can actually thank Warhammer for some of these ideas, because it actually pushed the MMO genre a little bit further. Warhammer Online also had something known as renown ranks, where a player would rank up their character in PvP from killing other players, and in which they could use to buy renown gear. Within the renown system offered titles and stat bonuses and points in which a player could use to further upgrade their character and buy gear. As you can tell, though, the game was obviously primarily focused on PvP content over PvE content. The game also gave players the ability to spec their characters to their liking, as each class had different paths that they could take, which offered different kinds of gameplay, comparable to how WoW specs actually function now. You could actually say that the way current specializations in WoW functions now are more closer to how they would function in Warhammer. What I mean by this is a player would pick a path, and then through points gained per level would decide on certain abilities to pick from. There was also a cool system in the game called the Tome of Knowledge, where a player could read up on the lore, tasks, and basically something that gave information about the game world and lore that was easily accessible to players without players having to go online. In conclusion, the most notable things I believe Warhammer brought to the table was its public quest system and the ability of players being able to queue from anywhere in the world. These are two things you see in almost every MMORPG now, and things Blizzard even brought into World of Warcraft. I still wish to see something like the Tome of Knowledge in WoW at some point. It's really cool having the lore of the game at your fingertips instead of having to go online to read up on it. So where did this game ultimately fail? Well, 3 months after launch, the game had tapered down to 300,000 subscribers, which is more than a 50% drop in its player base. For this to happen, a lot would have had to gone wrong. Obviously, in my opinion, the biggest failure being the content cut from launch, because right out, we have 800,000 players, and only half of these people are going to be able to see all this promised cut content eventually in future patches. So this right out affected the game from the start. Less content from the start means less things to do, means faster players are going to get bored. This is why you see such a large cut, or at least a large reason why we see such a large cut in subscribers early on in the game in the first 3 months of the game being out. The biggest mistake Warhammer made was cutting this promised content out directly before launch, as it set the path for failure of the game down the road. Shortly after the 300,000 sub announcement, the company reported about a $1 billion loss in the financial year for 2009. That's $1 billion, guys. That's insane. Consequently, the number of servers was drastically reduced, and eventually it got to the point where there remained only like 9 servers, 4 in the USA, 5 in Europe, and Mythic eventually started working on a free-to-play version of the game in order to try and save it and take in some revenue from possible pay-to-win features. However, the free-to-play system never panned out. It never happened. So why did so many people stop playing the game to begin with? Well, aside from the cut content and cut promises, players reported a horrendous lack of class balance, and because the game is PvP focused, obviously a large lack of class balance would ruin the game for many people. 2 of the classes reported as the most OP were the Bright Wizard and the Warrior Priest. There was also a population imbalance, which you could imagine would also absolutely destroy the game from a PvP perspective due to the RVR system, in which an enemy city could basically be sacked. Now imagine being the Order, which is one faction in the game, and Hordes of Destruction, which was the other faction, overwhelming you everywhere you went. It could definitely wreck the fun for many players. There was also server performance issues, and a lot of people found the PvP meaningless, that lacked the same emotional connection found in other games. For example, World of Warcraft with Horde vs Alliance, there was little to no faction pride in this game. The RVR zones were more like playing fields instead of faction homelands for you to defend. Also, you would think in a PvP focused game for the best gear to be earned from PvP, but a lot of the best gear was earned from dungeons, which added massive power to your character. There were also complaints of the game feeling too much like WoW, with substandard PvP, terrible crafting, underdeveloped PvE content, and poorly designed and implemented systems all around. The gold system, for example, was nearly useless, and because of it, the game lacked a proper economy. As time went on, a lot of zones were completely dead. RVR stagnated with time. Unless you were part of the launch, you missed out on a lot of the PvP in these zones, and the PvE content was lacking, yet the gear in PvE played a huge role in PvP, which means a lot of players were redoing the same old PvE content over and over and over again for gear upgrades in PvP, which obviously would have a large effect on replay value, as they would get bored from redoing the same PvE content over and over and over again, just to get some substantial gear upgrades in PvP. A lot of players also had issues with what they thought were bad animations and clunkiness, and what felt like a poor production quality. The game also became very repetitive as you got into the later levels, having to redo the same scenarios to level up, and not much changed at level cap. It was basically just, redo the same scenarios and the PvP, and unless you enjoyed the PvP in this game, you basically got bored very, very fast. In conclusion, I believe Warhammer's biggest failure was its class balance, animations and clunkiness, repetitive content, server performance issues, and the biggest thing was them cutting a gigantic portion of the content prior to release of the game, literally 2 months before the release of the game, after everybody had already pre-ordered and, you know, had already decided what classes they wanted to play as, especially with all that concept art, all those blog videos, all the hype. Everybody had, you know, laid out what they wanted to play, and a lot of that shit got cut right before release, and it obviously turned a lot of people off from the game. So looking towards the future, Warhammer did a lot of good things for the MMO genre, but it also failed in a lot of areas too, as you guys can see. Unfortunately, unlike most MMOs dwindling in population, you cannot play this game unless you go onto a private server community. This game still lives on, though in a much more unofficial context. Though it still is very possible for you to go back and relive the experience of this game, it's not exactly worth it unless you are a huge fan of the IP. Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning, may you rest in peace. And I think if you guys should take anything away from this video, and if any, you know, developers out there watching this video should take anything from it, it's the fact that you cannot rush these games. You cannot rush them to launch. You have to make sure all the systems are working, and it's not clunky. It's got a high production value. All of these things have to be in check before release. With Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning, I think EA just forced that release date way too hard on Mythic Entertainment, and I think Mythic could have used maybe an extra year on this game for it to really shine. And I think if it was given that extra year, I think this MMO might still be alive today, and unfortunately that never happened. So rest in peace, and this MMO will go down in history. A lot of its systems still kind of live on in other MMOs, as weird as that is. It did bring some new things to the MMO genre, which is why I wanted to cover it first in this episode, because I believe it offered a lot to the, like I said, to the MMO genre, and I'm just very happy this game existed, and I did have some fun with this game personally, and I just wish that it was given an extra year of development. As always, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of this series. The next MMO we are going to be taking a look at will be Star Wars: The Old Republic, and subscribe and let me know what you think below.